The Third Amendment forbids quartering troops in my home without my consent. I would argue that a back door into my hard drive or into my mobile device is the digital equivalent of quartering troops, because there were only a few reasons why they would have cared about that.
I'm Dr. Duke, and this is Constitution Corner. And this is the place on the internet where we really like to talk about not just what the Constitution says, but how the Constitution works or sometimes doesn't work in this modern era, or the problems that it faces. I'm joined today by Mitchell Shaw. Mitchell is a contributor to the New American Magazine. He also is the host of the popular Enemy of the Surveillance State podcast. Mitchell, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Duke. It's a pleasure to be here.
And our big Constitution question today, I think, is kind of an interesting one. There's no way the Founding Fathers 250 years ago could have envisioned the rise of the surveillance state, the ability of so-called private companies to completely determine, almost like they're private companies with almost government power, right? To affect and change your life, to promote what you do or to completely censor you. So let's start with this question. In this era of the surveillance state, and given the fact that the Founding Fathers couldn't have anticipated this, how do you think the way to fight this constitutionally is? Does the Constitution give us what we need to fight this particular form of anarchy?
That's a great question. So first, I think we need to distinguish between the surveillance state proper, which is, again, the NSA, FBI, CIA, et cetera, and then the surveillance as a culture, or what I call the surveillance as a feature, or the culture of surveillance that is Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, et cetera. And the real danger here is, so to answer your question briefly, yes, the Constitution actually does give us what we need. The Third Amendment to the Constitution forbids the quartering of troops without consent. Now, our founding fathers were, they didn't have crystal balls, but they did have a scriptural mindset. And sacred scripture tells us that there is nothing new under the sun. So they didn't attempt, I think, to address everything in specific, but I think that in their wisdom, they addressed everything in principle. The Third Amendment forbids quartering troops in my home without my consent. I would argue that a back door into my hard drive or into my mobile device is the digital equivalent of quartering troops, because there were only a few reasons why they would have cared about that. Think about this. The Crown says you're going to quarter these troops in your home. What are your concerns, Duke? One, they're consuming my resources. They're living in my home, taking up real estate. And two, they're here to listen to what I'm saying as I'm fomenting against the Crown. I'm trying to spark a rebellion and be free. So the digital equivalent of that is that the NSA or the FBI or the CIA or Facebook or Google or Twitter, which are not federal agencies, but are afforded an awful lot of protection by federal agencies in their sort of pseudo role as government entities, since they all have agreements with the surveillance state, the NSA in particular. They're afforded a lot of liberty there. So when they are taking up space on my hard drive, that's the equivalent of sleeping in my spare bedroom. That is space I cannot use. They are also consuming my resources. No, it's not fried chicken and mashed potatoes, but they're consuming part of my RAM, the memory on my computer that I need to run processes. They are consuming bandwidth that I need to upload and download content while I'm trying to make a living. And they are doing all of that while they are narking me out to the man, the same as those troops would have just broken their legs to get back to King George to tell him what was going on in the colonies. So this is the exact one-to-one digital equivalent of quartering troops. It's already forbidden in the Constitution, and it just needs to be enforced, like everything else in the Constitution that's not being enforced.
Amazing, isn't it? That once you put the Constitution back in play, there seems to be an argument to be made. I love the analogy between the Third Amendment. That's really a nice point there. How do you think that analogy though would stand up in a modern court of law? How you think depending upon who's adjudicating the case, what do you think the responses would be?
Well, I think it would seem like a novel argument because, again, a long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a false sense of being right. So because we've accepted this for so long, and this is one of the points that I make on my podcast, Enemy of the Surveillance State, that what one generation accepts the next generation will expect and subsequent generations will embrace and defend. My goodness, Duke, this is just the American way, and they're protecting the children and keeping us all safe from terrorists. If they have to consume a little bit of my hard drive and listen to my phone calls and my texts and my emails and my browsing history, I ought to just get over that. And so I don't know how a federal court would treat this, but I don't think we'd like it.
Well, my favorite is well, if you have nothing to hide, why should you care?
Dealt with that in the very first episode of the podcast.
Yep, it's amazing, isn't it? Well, tell people where they can find your information one last time.
enemyofsurveillance.podbean.com or anywhere where you listen to podcasts. Just look for Enemy of the Surveillance State.
Mitchell Shaw, I think you are exactly right, that as with everything else in modern contemporary life, that if you just go back and look at what the Founding Fathers were trying to tell us, you use the word in their wisdom. They didn't have crystal balls. You'd see that they got this one right, too. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Duke.
Don't just know your Constitution, live it. This has been Liberty News Hour. As always, you can go to thenewamerican.com and jbs.org for more information on these topics, as well as more shows.